Good morning. I hope you all can hear me. Wave your hands in the back if you can't. I think this microphone might be more for recording than it is for audio, so let me know if I'm fading out. I am Shelley McDermott Wadsworth. I'm the director of the Center for Families here at Purdue. I'm also a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. I'm really happy that you all are here. Thank you for coming. For some of you, this is a far journey across campus. Maybe some of you have never been in this building before, so welcome to a little adventure. I'm very happy that we're going to be hearing from Katina Sawyer today. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a little bit. I want to tell you first, though, about the Kanter Lecture Series and why it's here at Purdue and what it's all about. For 19 years now, the Center for Families, in partnership with the Boston College Center for Work and Family, have collaborated to administer the Rosabeth Moss Kanter Award for Excellence in Research on Work and Family. Rosabeth Moss Kanter is a past editor of the Harvard Business Review. She's on the faculty at Harvard. In 1977, she wrote a very powerful book about work and family in the United States and a critical agenda for research. And that book, in many ways, is considered to have begun what we would call the modern work-family movement. That's why the award is named after her, with her permission. And so I get to report to her every year about what we have done, and every once in a while we have a phone call. At the time that we created this, there wasn't really even a field of work and family, and there certainly wasn't a professional association for work-family researchers. So we were little clusters of people in lots of different departments. I remember at the Academy of Management, there'd be like 10 work-family people there, and we would just go around to all the conference hotels presenting to each other, right? Like this little cabal, and there'd be another group at NCFR, and there'd be another group. And so it really wasn't coalescing. And the other thing that we saw was that I'd talk to people here at Kanter, and they would say, we just discovered whatever. And I would be like, well, they've been talking about that in family studies for like a decade, Or I would say, I just discovered whatever. And the Kanter people would be like, and we weren't reading each other. We didn't even know where to find each other. We didn't even know who each other was. And there were complaints that we were just stuck. We were doing the same studies over and over again and complaining that companies aren't paying attention to what we're doing, so we're not helping employees. And companies are complaining because we're doing this research that's completely irrelevant. And so we started the award as a way to try to raise awareness of really high quality work, both within the academic community and the corporate community, to grow a stronger connection between academia and the corporate world, and to try to coalesce this area of research so that it moves forward more instead of just cycling around doing the same things over again with people in isolation. Our two organizations together over the last 19 years have worked to foster a community now of over 700 scholars who contribute to the Kanter effort, and also to educate corporate practitioners, because in the United States, unlike most other countries in the world, we rely on companies to do many of the things for families that in other countries the government does. And so companies in the United States end up being a very important force in employees' access to retirement, pensions, health care, child care, and quality of life in general. The committee for the Kanter is approximately 70 people from 14 countries every year, and the enthusiasm for this award is evidenced by the fact that I now send out an email saying it's time to populate the committee, and in 48 hours I have 70 people, almost without fail. At most I send out 2 emails. So they're very enthusiastic. It saves them a lot of work, actually, because they end up with a list of the best studies and they don't have to do it all by themselves. So that's good. In the military, they would call that a self-licking ice cream cone. The award supports itself, and that's really good. So the process for this award is that you can't apply for it. People don't even know their work is being considered until they're told that they made it into the top group. There's a list of now 80 journals. The review committee looks at every article published in those 80 journals, and members of the committee are asked to select one They're assigned 3 to 5 journals to look at. They're asked to nominate 1 article. Every journal is looked at by at least 2 people, usually 3. And they can nominate anything. They don't have to be limited to those journals. If they know of great work somewhere else, they can nominate that. They can even nominate their own work if they want. But then in the second round of review, each of the nominated articles is sent to 5 people to score quantitatively according to a standardized set of criteria, and that determines the top group. And then the final 5 articles, the finalists, are sent out to the entire committee to be scored. And at that stage in the process, a panel of corporate professionals joins the process, and they help make the final selection. And then we're very happy to notify the people who have won the award, as well as their department heads and their deans and their journal editors, that this has happened. And the journals usually agree to give free access to the articles for a while, and then I go report to the corporate community about it. And now there's a professional association of work-family researchers, an academic society called the Work-Family Researchers Network, and we present the award there as well. So we try to really use this to bring together. And after doing it for probably 15 years, we realized, you know, this is completely not visible on campus. It's really the Academy Awards of Work-Family Research around the world, but our campus knows nothing about it. Well, that seems kind of stupid. So we created the Kanter Lecture. And true to the spirit of the Kanter effort, we use the Kanter Lecture to bring together people across the campus whose work touches the same issues that these studies are about. Almost every study of work and family is somehow about gender or status or resources or psychological well-being or health or things that everybody in this room is concerned about. And I would guess, as was the case in the work-family literature years ago, many of you don't know each other. You don't know what each other does. You don't know the journals that you each publish in. You don't make a point of looking for those journals. And this effort is a small effort to try to kind of combat that isolation. So we're really grateful to the departments that contribute to the effort. This year, the Kanter School of Management, the Department of Sociology, the Departments of Psychological Sciences and Human Development and Family Studies within the College of Health and Human Sciences, and this Susan Bulkley Butler Center for Leadership Excellence. This effort is also supported, is this one I should go forward, do you think? These are the companies that are part of the Work-Family Roundtable at Boston College. So these are the companies that I go to report the results of this study to, and these are the companies from whom the corporate reviewers come. Early on in the award, we had sponsorship from a professional society of work-life professionals, and they decided they had to stop sponsoring it, and we were trying to figure out what we would do to cover the costs of the winner, you know, coming to the ceremonies and all that sort of stuff. And we were talking to these folks at their meeting about it, and we said, well, we're going to put out a sponsorship announcement, and if any of you might be interested. These folks pay, you were in the room at the time, I think, but you were, at the time, you were paying like, what, $7,000 a year or something to belong? 10. Yeah, it's gone way up. So we're in the room, and we're saying, oh, by the way, I'm going to acknowledge you officially in a minute, but this is Candy Lang here from Kanter. But somebody in the room said, well, why do we wait for that? Why don't we just increase our dues? And we said, oh, that's a good idea. We'll take that up with the steering committee. And they said, no, let's vote now. And they voted. And so they voted to increase their dues by $500 a year, in perpetuity, basically, to support this award. 50 of the largest corporations in the world who collectively affect the quality of life of millions and millions of employees are paying for the wonkiest academic process you can imagine. And then they're very eager to meet the winners. So you'll be there in the fall. You'll be asked to present to them. These are the people you'll be talking to, and they help select your award, or I assume they'll be inviting you for the fall. I don't want to get ahead of myself. It's a wonderful joining opportunity, and I'm so happy that you all have shown that you have come. I also want to acknowledge Candy Lang. We were just talking, we met almost 30 years ago. At the time, Candy was in charge of work-life programs at Eli Lilly and Company. She presided over the creation of on-site childcare at Eli Lilly. She presided over all of the things that Eli Lilly and Company did that got them onto the Working Mother 100 list and kept them there for many years. Today, she runs the Jane Brock Wilson Center in the Kanter School of Management. And Candy and her faculty colleagues have culled through the leading research and come up with takeaways for corporate practitioners. So we'll be sending that out through this network as well as through your network to try to help corporate professionals think about the implications of the work for their practice. So again, you know, we're all about leverage. And Candy also sits on the advisory council of the Center for Families. So we're really grateful that you're here. And also there's an MFRI alum in the room. Kyung-hee Lee did a postdoc at MFRI. So we're really happy to have her here. Ellen Kosick is not here today. She's the lead of the Kanter contribution to this effort. She's on sabbatical and sends her regrets. At your seats, you have evaluation forms. I hope that you will fill them out. You also have a copy of the first page of the article, and you have a list of the articles, the official nominees from 2018. So all of that being said, sorry, I'm 2 minutes over, apologies. I'm happy to welcome Katina as she walks us through her work on the 2018 Kanter Award nominated article, Invisible Families, Invisible Conflicts, examining the added layer of work-family conflict for employees with LGB families. Katina is an assistant professor of management at George Washington University in the School of Business. Her areas of expertise include diversity, work-life balance, leadership, and negative workplace behaviors. Prior to joining the faculty at the George Washington University, she was an assistant professor of psychology at Villanova. She's published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters about leadership, diversity, training effectiveness, performance appraisal systems, and work-family conflict. She's also presented at various academic conferences, including the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, the National Women's Studies Association, and the Academy of Management. And her work has been cited in many public outlets, including Bloomberg Businessweek, The Atlantic, Forbes, and The Conversation. As a faculty member, she uses her expertise to teach future HR leaders about how to maximize the potential of the human resources within their organizations and how to effectively align human resource practices with business objectives. She owns K. Sawyer Solutions, a consulting firm, which offers data-driven solutions to organizations with regard to selection, assessment, and leadership development. She holds a dual Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology and women's studies. That's not the most common combination.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah, the Pennsylvania State University. Received her BA from Villanova. The work that she's presenting today comes from her dissertation, so I've encouraged her to be open with all the students in the room about her journey to publishing this paper. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sawyer. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me here. I am so excited to be here. I've been pumped to come present to this group for a really long time. As soon as I got the email, I was super excited. So it's always good to have a generative and fun dialogue with a bunch of really smart people. So dialogue is the operative word here. I want to hear from you if you have questions. I'd love to, we'll have Q&A at the end, but if there's a burning question that you have, please don't hold it inside, get it out. We can have dialogue as the conversation goes on. And I just really, really thank you. It's such an honor. And I know it's hard to get people to come out on a Friday in April. So just really, really grateful to be here. So a little bit of a roadmap. I'm going to start off just telling you a little bit about my background, a little bit about me. I know that Shelley gave me such a nice introduction, and I'll give you a little bit more on that. And then I'm going to walk through the study design and findings of the paper that we're talking about today. And then I'm going to kind of broaden the lens out and talk about some implications and lessons learned in the process of writing this paper, publishing this paper, and also what I think we can do next as a collective. So I know not everyone in here might be a work family researcher themselves, but I think that there are things that we can all do to think about the ways in which work and family might fit together for individuals in stigmatized populations. So let's hop in. So a little bit of background about me. As Shelley mentioned, I'm kind of an odd case. I have a dual PhD in industrial organizational psychology and women's studies. When I entered my IO Psych PhD program, I really was liking my classes, leadership classes and training classes and performance management classes, and really enjoying the corporate aspect of learning about how businesses function from a research perspective. But I've always been very interested in social justice and very interested in understanding how our work can impact broader societal level problems like poverty, social inequity, health, etc. And I felt like while I really enjoyed the classes that I was taking in IO Psych, something was missing for me. And sort of like a lightning bolt, sometimes you have these like lightning bolt moments in your life. Someone mentioned to me, there's this dual program that you can sign up for. If they let you in, you can get a Ph.D. in women's studies at the same time that you get a Ph.D. in psychology. And Penn State's one of 2 universities in the country where you can do that. The other is Michigan. And so I was like, wow, this is a thing I didn't know about. This is cool. Let me see about that. And everybody in the IO program, with very good advice from a practical perspective, said, do not do this. There's a reason that no one has done the IO Women's Studies PhD before. The first person to do it is either really smart or really stupid, and we don't know which one it's going to be. So there's a 50% shot you're going to be really stupid, and maybe you should avoid that. So I kind of put my blinders on and said, no. I feel really passionate about this. I actually want to give it a shot, and if it's a failure, maybe I'll reverse course. And so I applied for the program. They let me into the program, and it has honestly been one of the best decisions that I've ever made. Sitting around talking about corporate bottom line in half of my classes and how do we increase effectiveness, and then talking about basically like socialist approaches to social equity in my other classes, and putting those 2 things together and saying, okay, the reality is that we live in the world that we live in, right? So we're not going to wake up tomorrow and be in some other economy. That's the reality. So while we're in this economy, how can we take some of what women's studies scholars are talking about over here and some of what we're talking about in terms of selling these ideas to business professionals from a bottom line perspective? How do we put these things together to actually achieve and start to think about social equity and justice? So that's kind of where I started. And I was taking a class, which was actually, so the women's studies program was interdisciplinary. So I took courses in sociology, psychology, anthropology, just general feminist theory classes, and then I also took classes in geography, specifically social geography. So one of the best classes I ever took was with Melissa Wright. She's a very famous social geographer, and she talks about who can be what, where, how, and how does the context around us from a geographical perspective impact our identities and our identity management. So it doesn't sound too far off from some stuff that we study in management. But while I was in that class, I was writing my master's thesis, and my master's thesis was on work family kind of proper. I was looking at female breadwinners and the impact of female breadwinner status on the ways in which couples split housework. And I was very interested in that project and had read a lot about work and family as a result of preparing for my thesis. And while I was doing that and doing that writing and sitting in this class, I started to think about, well, how do norms in organizations impact who can be what, where, when with regard to their family identity? And I thought, well, surely I'm not the first person to think of this. Let me go dig through and see what I can find. And what I found was, in the literature, there wasn't too much. So I started doing a lit review thinking, well, of course, I'm going to go out to the literature and find dozens of papers on alternative family structures and the ways in which work and family might conflict differently. And what I found was that actually there wasn't a lot of conversation going on about that, particularly within management and IO literature. There had been some studies on same-sex couples and work-family conflict, but primarily what I found was that those studies were basically taking measures we already had of work and family and measuring them within same-sex couples. So the reimagination of the construct and the way that I was thinking about it wasn't really happening. And of course, there's an established literature on stigma in the workplace, which I read a lot about and was starting to think about as I was honing in on my question. And this geography class that I took specifically focused on queer identities. So people who sort of identify themselves as being sort of fluid over time with regard to their sexuality or gender expression, et cetera. And it was a particularly potent class to be talking about those sorts of things because you can imagine if you view your identity as more fluid, there may be more opportunities for you to adapt your identity or negotiate your identity within different geographical locations. So I started to think about what would be a great population for me to get at or think about how people might make these sorts of negotiations between the way that they view their identity at home and the way that they view their identity at work and how they talk about those sorts of things. And at the same time, I had been very involved in some LGBT activism on campus. At Penn State, I was elected the representative to the Commission for LGBT Equity. that reported directly to the president at that time. So I was hearing a lot on campus about different students' experiences of how they brought their LGBT identity to school. And so I started to put these pieces together and thought, okay, I'm interested in who can be what, where, when from a family identity perspective. Where do I start? And so I started with thinking about same-sex couples. One of the things that I think is really interesting about LGB identity, because there was a nascent and ever-growing still literature on LGBT identities in organizations in general. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about LGB identity, so I'm purposefully leaving the T off because gender expression is a different area. I have a bunch of studies right now that are starting to hit and are in progress in transgender populations, but that's a different talk. But within LGB populations, there's sort of this interesting story from a stigma perspective, because I can be LGB and someone can know, let's say I'm a lesbian and I'm at work and someone can know that I'm a lesbian, right? That particular piece of my identity has something to do with how you view me as an individual, and that's the way that the stigma literature has looked at it. So you know something about me that's stigmatized. But because LGB identity is about sexual orientation, it has this relational element that other kinds of stigmatized identities don't have, right? So, or may not have. So if we talk about stigma associated with race or stigma associated with gender, for example, oftentimes we'll lump all these different stigmatized identities together into one sort of, this is the population, or these are the groups that face stigma. And while it's not inappropriate to put LGB individuals in that group, because they do face stigma when they disclose their sexual orientation or in daily negotiations and talking about their personal lives, which is what I'll discuss, there's something different about this real or perceived other that people are picturing when you reveal your LGB identity to somebody, right? So it's not just about me being a racial minority or being a woman or whatever the case may be that I have stigma. It's like, you know this about me and it has this other, and then that means that there's someone else, or imagine someone else, or maybe there's no one else, but people are just thinking about who would that other person be, right? So there's this relational element to LGB stigma that people weren't really talking about, that people weren't really picking up on. So I wanted to understand how does this relational element play out, and where were these LGB families in our literature, and how were they managing their work and family lives? And I just didn't see much going on, and so this became the central question of my dissertation. I realized that there was enough of a gap here that, hey, this could be a dissertation, which is a really cool moment to have, especially because I thought I was going to find an onslaught of stuff, and maybe my bump in what we were learning was going to be adding to an existing literature, and I found out there really wasn't much. So before I go much further, I'm sure everybody in this room knows what is work-family conflict, and this is what I started to focus on in my study, is the ways in which work and family might conflict differently for those with LGB identities. So this is the classic definition, 1985 Greenhouse and Butel, form of interrole conflict in which role pressures from work and family domains are incompatible in some respect. That participation in work or family is made more difficult by participating in family or work. And generally we think about this in terms of 3 dimensions: time, strain, and behavior. Basically, like, I don't have enough time to get done all the stuff that I have to do at work and family, so I need more hours in the day. My family's really stressful, my work is really stressful, so when I come home, I'm upset, or when I go into work, I'm upset, right? And behavior, the types of things that make me successful at work are not the types of things that make me successful at home. So maybe I have to be a really hard-hitting, competitive person at work, and then I come home and I don't want to be hard-hitting and competitive with my partner, right? So these are the sorts of dimensions that had been traditionally studied at the time that I started my study, and these dimensions aren't bad. So I want to say, like, these are good dimensions of work-family conflict. They've been replicated in many, many ways. So it's not that I'm trying to say these aren't good. I just think that they're incomplete because we haven't asked questions in a different way. So if we start by, instead of centering the experiences of what we think about as a traditional family, and imagine for ourselves, okay, what might the struggles of a traditionally structured family look like, we might come out with a list like this. But if we start from a different center and say, what would the challenges of a family that doesn't fit that nuclear, heterosexual, traditional family structure look like, we might come up with a different set of questions, right? And because we hadn't decentered that, what was the notion of family people were thinking about when they were writing work-family studies, we weren't coming up with questions that actually comprehensively addressed all of the different variations in ways in which family might face challenges. So when I went to the literature, some limitations I found. There wasn't really a lot of examination of family structure or family type, aside from single parents had been examined quite a bit. And there was a little bit on like elder care and grandparents, things like that being incorporated into family structures. There was some on divorce and things of that nature. So there were things that were sort of off the traditional nuclear path, but I was having a really hard time finding anything that was actually thinking specifically about the experiences of same-sex couples. I also found that we didn't ask about sexuality when administering work-family conflict surveys. So you give a survey to somebody and you say, what's your work-family conflict look like? And there was no question for, by the way, what sexual orientation do you identify with? So almost all of the studies I found, and I went through, I had like a box. I felt like one of those like, you know, you probably feel like this sometimes with research papers, but those people that like are trying to solve a crime and they have like a map and there's all these strings and they're like linking things together. And I was pulling like the most cited work-family conflict papers and realized that they hadn't even measured sexuality in those papers. So I was like, okay, well, we could have some people in these studies that are not straight, but we don't know, right? We actually don't know. So it was sort of like this invisibilizing of individuals who are not heterosexual within our studies, which was abstracting these issues. So there was no clear idea of how work-family conflict, or family work conflict for that matter, might be experienced differently by LGBT families. And the current measures assumed that all families looked alike and faced the same challenges. So I was imagining, as I started to get further into this, some of the measures, time, strain, behavior, and thinking as an LGBT person sitting down to fill out that measure, and thinking about, great, I'm going to talk about my work and family conflict, and sitting down to fill out the survey that the organization gives me. And they're asking a bunch of questions about time or stress, or is the way that you can be at work from a behavioral perspective the same as you can be at home? And sitting there and thinking, but I can't even talk about my family at work. I don't feel comfortable revealing what I did over the weekend. Where do I tell you about that, right? And so I was picturing that in my mind of how many people may have sat down to our surveys as academics and become very frustrated about the fact that their conflicts were not represented in what our items were showing. So the more I got to know what the measures look like and what the literature looked like, the more motivated I was to sort of solve this problem. So just a little bit more about why work-family conflict might be experienced differently for LGBT employees. There are lots of reasons to believe that these workplace experiences might be different. Number one, just from a discrimination perspective, most states today do not have an Employee Non-Discrimination Act, which basically is just an act that would say you cannot be fired solely based on your sexuality. So today in the United States, most states, anybody can be fired solely due to their sexuality, no legal recourse. And there's no federal law that protects that either. That's still the case. ENDA has been a really interesting piece of legislation because it gets picked up and dropped and picked up and dropped over the course of a bunch of different administrations, and it seems like no one really wants to champion it. For some reason, this is controversial that people shouldn't be fired solely due to their sexuality. I'm not really sure why, but nobody seems to want to really make that their mantle yet, so it hasn't gone too far. 59% of non-LGBTQ workers say they think it's unprofessional to talk about sexual orientation at work. But then when we ask them to self-report about how often they talk about their spouses or families or life, they say, oh yeah, I talk about that all the time, right? So I have this really interesting story of an executive that I was coaching along with a group of other people, and so he was trying to wrap his head around, he really wanted to be inclusive, and he was trying to wrap his head around this idea of LGBT inclusivity, and he's kind of an old school guy, and he was like, I get gender, I get gender advancement, and I get racial minority diversity inclusion, but I just can't wrap my head around sexual orientation. And we were trying to work through what is it that's difficult for you about this? And he was like, you know, I just don't get why people should have to like come to work and talk about their sexuality. I just don't get it. Like, why is this a thing? Like, I don't come to work and talk about my sexuality. Why do they feel like they have to come to work and just be blasting their sexuality all day? So we just paused, and I just said, why don't you just like take a look at the pictures you have in your office for a second? So turned around, and it's him and his wife at their wedding, and him and his wife and their kids, and all this stuff. And I said, would you consider that you blasting your sexuality to people? And he said, well, no, that's my family. And I was like, right, that's what they're talking about too. They don't want to come in and tell you weird sex stories, right? They want to talk about their family. They want to come in and tell you about what they did over the weekend. Like, they're talking about the same thing you're talking about. You just don't think about it as sexuality because you've set heterosexuality as this norm. It's invisibilized. We don't even think about it as a sexuality because that's just like what exists, right? So interesting that now HRC has actually quantified that experience that I had several years ago and saying that it's actually fairly prevalent that people feel this way, hold both of these ideas at the same time even though they're conflicting. 60% of LGBT people have reported being fired from a job or denied a job, compared to 40% of heterosexual people, and 48% of LGBT people have said they've been denied a promotion or received a negative evaluation, compared to 32% of heterosexual people. So when we compare the stats in terms of breaking these things down, we see that there's something going on that's due to sexuality that causes more negative workplace outcomes compared to heterosexual counterparts. So there's a reason that we might think that this would be different. So with all of this research that shows that there's some documented stigma and discrimination towards LGBT individuals, the experience of work-family conflict might also be different for members of an LGBT relationship or family. So with that, I started to think about what are my research questions. And because I knew that there wasn't a lot on this, I had to tackle it from a very grounded perspective. So often when you have a question that you feel not a lot of people are asking, you have to start by asking questions of the individuals, in-depth questions of the individuals who are having these experiences in order to get at, like, what is this content domain even? So I started with a grounded theory approach, working through qualitative interviews with these two questions. So does perceived membership in a stigmatized family create added stigma-related stress that promotes unique work-family conflicts for employees with LGBT families? And are there additional strains related to these work-family conflicts that impact individuals with LGBT families? So the pretty basic questions, is this different, right? Does the work-family conflict process look different? So what did I do to answer these questions? So I collected some qualitative data to get a deeper understanding of the work-family experience of those in LGBT families. And at the end of all of the data collections, which I did a couple extra data collections for some rounds of revision, which in full disclosure, and I'm happy to talk about this too, this paper went through 2 rounds of revision at a very top tier journal, and ended up getting bounced, which was very sad. But through that process, I collected some additional data. So the initial sample that I had was 41. I ended up with 53, and I didn't have the paired sample that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's another sample that didn't even make it to the final paper that I'll also talk about. So I basically interviewed 53 LGBT individuals who considered themselves part of a family. And I also interviewed 12 paired coworkers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I asked them their questions about their work-family conflict experiences. So I did not ask leading questions. I basically said, tell me about the work-family conflict that you experience as an employee. And I was really interested to find out that about half of my participants, the very first thing they did was, okay, let me tell you about the conflict. There's this guy who sits next to me, and he's really anti-LGBT. And every time I talk about my family and what I did for the weekend, he makes groaning noises, or he rolls his eyes to his coworkers, right? These were the main things. They weren't saying, like, let me talk about work and family. I spend too much time at work. That was there. All of the individuals that I interviewed did report those kinds of conflicts, but more than half of my sample immediately launched into stuff that sounds a lot more like what I'm going to present. So not only was it there, it was also very top of mind for people to be speaking about. So after I got the qualitative data, I had recorded the interviews and transcribed them, and we went through. You're not going to be able to see this. It's in the paper if you're interested, but I just wanted to walk you through a little bit of the process in case you're not as familiar with qualitative methods. So basically, we went through all these transcripts, all the transcript data, coded them for themes, and then what came out were all these little pieces which are representative of groups of quotes that we sort of named and said, okay, these are all the different bullet points that are emerging as themes. And then we grouped the themes according to what seems similar. So that's one side of our model called repeating ideas. And then we took those groups of quotes that seem similar and we pushed them up into higher order constructs, study themes, which basically are groupings of those smaller ones that are over here, right? So those arrows are sort of continuing over to group into these. And then we use those study themes and group them to theoretical constructs. So it's basically this process where you take the raw data, make it more bundled into ideas that are showing up, bundle those ideas into themes, and then bundle the themes into theoretical constructs. And then the last piece is that we take those boxes that you're seeing there, and we put them into a model. So we basically took a look at, okay, what is it that our participants are telling us? And this can't be seen as a causal model. We need more testing in terms of thinking about it that way. But basically, we looked through the transcripts and thought about, okay, not just how do these boxes and what are the content of the boxes, but how do they fit together? How are people talking about first this happened, then this happened, then that happened, right? So how are people talking about through time what their experiences are as they're unfolding? And we put those into a model. Now, this is a big model, and I'm going to talk through mostly the right side of the model for today, but I did want to hone in on our main conflict of interest, this middle box, which is what I'm calling stigma-based work-family conflict, which is the added layer of conflict that is experienced when perceived family-related stigma in one's work role makes it difficult to fulfill one's family role. And of course, we could switch that around and make it family to work as well. But for this particular case, we're focused on work-family conflict. So just some stressors that illustrate some of what people were talking about. So really the idea of stigma-based work-family conflict is the felt tension. So there's a tension between work and family when I get an invitation to a work event and I see that it says spouses. And for some individuals that I interviewed, they were recalling experiences from before gay marriage was legal. So it says spouses and they're looking at it and saying, well, what about my partner, right? So there's a felt tension there. I would really like to bring my partner, but I don't know if they're welcome. A lack of same-sex partner benefits at work despite a desire of employees to utilize such benefits in order to support their families. Pressure to suppress LGBT family information at work despite feeling pressure to share such information to be true to one's family identity. So like, well, you know, you can't talk about that in front of Carl, right? Because that won't help you out. Even though you really want to be able to talk about it in front of that person, or you wish that you don't have to monitor yourself. This is the tension that people were bringing up. So on the right side of that model there, we see these tensions, these felt tensions, seem to predict employee behaviors within the LGBT population, that they were doing these identity management behaviors as a result of these tensions. So 3 of those behaviors came out, and I'm just going to give you a quote from each. One was suppression or fabrication of family information. So I feel this tension, my identity is not accepted, I don't know how to make work and family fit together. So one thing that I might do is say, you know what, I'm just not going to talk about this at work. I'm just going to not share information. Or in some cases, in more extreme cases, people actually fabricated, like they would, you know, not use pronouns of the person that they were talking about. And if someone said like, oh, you know, a gay guy, did you go on vacation with your wife? He'd be like, yeah. There was one woman I talked to that said, I think everyone at work thinks I'm really weird because I never show like a lot of pictures of my vacation, and all the pictures I show I'm by myself. So she actually was out with a lot of people in the workplace, but felt like showing the pictures with her partner was like too much. So something interesting to note, most of the people in my sample were out. It was just that they felt that continuing to, like, I'm using their quotes, like hammer people over the head with family information was too much. So this is not necessarily a disclosure related issue. This is a different kind of issue that's related to, okay, now that you know that I have this stigma that has some relational consequences, how much do I bring that up? And that's where it really enters into the work family domain and outside of just the straight discrimination or disclosure domain. So this first quote I think is really interesting. So this guy's workplace had a contest, a family photo contest for Work Family Week. So they were trying to be progressive in terms of work family. And they said, bring in a picture of your family and hang it up on the wall, and the best family photo wins this Work Family Week prize or whatever. And he described to me in the interview this moment where he brought the photo in, and he was standing in front of the wall, and he looked at the whole wall, and he saw nobody looked like his family. And he had this like conflict of, what do I do? Do I put my picture up here as a way of making a statement, or do I take it down? And he decided not to put it up. So he said, I just felt like they wouldn't, I mean, a photo of my family would actually be considered almost aggressive, I think, on behalf of the institution, because it would be kind of me trying to make an activist point about the very narrow definition of family that was circulating around the whole event. And I just felt that they were asking me when they were using the word family, well, they weren't including me. So he decided not to put his picture up on the wall. So I thought that was an interesting, clear, related behavior. Some people mentioned, even though they were out at work, not bringing their family members into the workplace or not wanting them to come. So this person said, this person was sort of describing, I'm not a stereotypically gay guy. I don't have those kinds of characteristics, but my partner does. And I think people are okay with me because I don't have those characteristics, but I don't really want them to know that the person that I'm with does, because I don't know how they'll judge me being associated with someone who's stereotypically gay in that sense, right? So he was saying, I don't really feel like there's a place for him in my work environment that he could come visit me. He went on to say he doesn't know how he would navigate the sensitivities. And then he says, that's a terrible way of saying it. He actually got embarrassed when he was talking to me about it. I don't want to reveal that that was my thought process, but that's why I haven't asked him to come meet people at work. And then differential disclosure. So this person was out to everyone except HR. Apparently HR was the people that were the most likely to be discriminatory, and they had been warned about the director of HR being very anti-LGBT. And so they said that they could not reveal that to HR because but it made it difficult because the person in HR didn't know that they had to coordinate with somebody else for travel, like when their flights could come in or childcare responsibilities or whatever. They were just totally not out to HR. So they said traveling for work would be a lot easier if I could talk to the folks in HR about the fact that I have to coordinate, but they can't know about that. So it was creating all these disruptions to their family life because they were unable to be honest about this. As a result of these identity management behaviors, whether or not they were successful, we found that people felt a lot of guilt around these things. And so generally, people weren't super happy to be suppressing or physically separating or differentially disclosing. So a lot of what was a response to this was some added strains, psychological strains from these behaviors. So one of the strains was this sense of hypervigilance. A lot of people talked about, I know that people at work seem open and accepting, and they know that I'm out, but I also need to mention, that I'm just not sure about how things would go. Depersonalization, I'm very frank and honest at home, but disconnected from that me at home. I was that honest about myself at work, it would impact my relationships with clients. So people feeling disconnected from themselves, feeling like their family dignity was denigrated in the workplace, and also feeling fragmented. So this person was talking about she was having a lot of problems with her partner. And she was saying, at home, there's a lot of stuff going on that's centered around my gay relationship. I honestly can't let any of that out at work. So I wish that I could mention to people that things were not going well, but she actually felt like if she mentioned things weren't going well, it would look negatively on the LGBT population as a whole. Like she felt like she had to be like a token almost of like, look, we have great families and things are going well, etc. So she was keeping that inside and then basically said she felt like she was back in high school when she wasn't out to anybody. Because she was channeling that piece of herself, keeping an important piece of herself from others. So just quickly, I did check to make sure that this was not something that was happening in other samples of individuals. And so I did ask individuals who were fully out in the workplace and had a coworker that they felt comfortable asking. I did go back to my participants and ask if anybody was willing to do that, and 12 people said that they were. So they found somebody in their same role with their same title in the same organization, and I interviewed those people and asked them about, do you think stigma based around your family has anything to do with the way you experience work and family conflict? And most of them were like, what? So the quotes there basically reflect that. What? Not really. I don't think so. Can you repeat that question? I don't really know what you're asking. So that was a good cementing experience. I also, this is part of a data collection that didn't end up in the paper, but I think it's just interesting. I asked, does this apply to a broader sample of stigmatized families? So I chose LGBT individuals as a place to start, but does this extrapolate out? So I interviewed 15 people who had self-identified as having other kinds of stigma, like being partnered with someone who had a physical disability, someone who struggled with mental health issues, interreligious relationships, somebody who had a previously incarcerated partner, interracial relationships. So I interviewed 15 people who self-identified as having a stigmatized family. And what I found was that there were some different things that mattered in that sample. So much like some of the classic work by Goffman on stigma, I found that perceived controllability was an issue. So this quote was somebody whose wife was managing MS, and so he had a lot of work and family conflicts from that. But he said, well, I think we kind of were okay though, because it's not like we, could have done this. She didn't do it to herself. She didn't have control over it. Whereas I interviewed somebody else who was partnered with someone who had AIDS, and that person felt like they faced extreme stigma for illness management because people saw it as being their partners. Why would you choose to partner with somebody that has AIDS or would make decisions that would lead them to have AIDS, et cetera? So there was different kinds of stigma. Perceived peril or threat. This quote is from a woman who had a son that had autism. And she said that while she faced a lot of work-family challenges with autism, and she did have some people make comments to her about like vaccinations and, maybe you did this to him and whatever. Primarily, she talked about how people kind of feel like people with autism are nice and kind and they're a bit more helpless, in contrast to someone who we interviewed who had a son who was schizophrenic, who said that she faced a lot of hardship in talking about that at work. So this perceived peril or threat and perceived controllability. And then we also found that the more intersectional stigmatized identities people had, the more complicated this became. So this woman was talking about being a black single mother versus she saw being a black single mother as being a stigmatized identity compared to just being a black mother in general. And also gender and family role ideology of the workplace overall seemed to play a role. So people felt like more people were stigmatized for having families that didn't fit a box if they were in an organization that was very masculinized and very strongly rooted in traditional family role identity. So what are some general takeaways? Families that perceive stigma in the workplace do experience a unique form of work-family conflict and deploy different identity management techniques. All participants, again, reported experiencing traditional work-family conflict. It's not like that should go away. It's just that there's this additional layer of conflict that exacerbated work-family challenges that was going previously undetected. And organizations really need to understand the full spectrum of work-family issues in order to create comprehensive solutions and understand and be inclusive of diversity within work and family. So just a couple notes that I want to put out there. What can we do about it societally? So we're in a very interesting political time frame, I think. And it's important to think about what we can do. I know it's very overwhelming and it can be like numbing. There's so much going on and you don't know what to do to take action. But we do live in a time when LGBT rights are increasingly under fire. Today, the transgender military ban goes into effect. And so we live in a time when these rights are under fire. And while there have been hopes for ENDA in the past, which may prevent some of these stigma-based conflicts reported by participants, the likelihood that this legislation is going to be passed anytime in the near future is very low. But the good news is studies show that while legislation helps, more proximal policies and organizational policies and the micro behaviors that happen between people in the job is actually more important for predicting well-being. So what can we all do? Your actions do matter. So ask yourself some questions. Whose family is being left out at work in your organizational structure? Who might feel uncomfortable talking about their family with you or with others? How can you show that you're an ally to these communities by signaling that you're open to all kinds of families? How can you advocate for better and more inclusive policies and practices and behaviors within your own organization? And then ask members of the LGBT community themselves questions, or members of those that you might know or be aware of that they face some stigma or struggle with this. How would you prefer I use my position to advocate for better policies and practices? How can I encourage others to become allies too? And then listen to the answers and work with those folks to find solutions in a way that works for everybody. In another study that my colleagues, Christian Thorogood from Villanova University and Jenica Webster from Marquette, we found that the act of oppositional courage, which are just micro acts that show support in favor of or in support of stigmatized populations, actually made a huge difference on the well-being and job attitudes of individuals who face stigma at work. So that means that all of your actions matter. Even small things that you can do. You can be the one that someone remembers 10 years from now. You know, I felt really crappy in that job, but this one person stood up and did something and it really made a difference for me in the way that I felt in my organization. Or you can be the one who's a leader and inspires lots of other ones to behave that way. And I just think we can't forget or get complacent when it comes to human rights. So I was watching Will and Grace recently, which you feel really old when you're old enough to both have watched the original and the reboot of a show. But I was watching Will and Grace recently and saw an episode where Will, who's one of the show's gay characters, if you're not familiar, starts dating someone much younger than him. And the episode's really funny, the show's really funny, but towards the end of the episode, he asks his newfound dating partner if he'd like to attend a pride parade with him. And the dating partner says, no, I'm not interested in that. And Will was really confused, why not? And he said, well, you know, I just feel like that's over. Like, we don't need to worry about LGBT rights anymore. Like, I live in Brooklyn, I have a boyfriend, you know, we can hold hands, we can go wherever we want. I don't feel like there's really a need for the pride parade before. And Will kind of took a step back and realized that they had lived through really different times as in the LGBT community. And he said, you know, I think it's great that you feel comfortable as a gay man living in New York City. And I'm going to read the quote. He said, you can never forget the struggle that came before you, the people that fought and loved and died so that you could walk down the street with rights you never even knew you had. The minute we forget what we went through to get here is the minute it could all be taken away. And I found that that quote was very powerful. And I think that we also have to remember that subtle discrimination is still alive and well, even if more blatant discrimination has been repealed in the recent past. We have to remember that people can still be fired for just being LGB in most states and at the federal level. And we can't take current climates or laws for granted because, as we know, and as today marks, more progressive policies can be reversed. So we have to keep human rights on our radar, or we risk losing the America that I think has always been great. An America that is tolerant and accepting and willing to see beyond demographic features to discover the people inside. The last thing that I want to mention is that particularly in business schools, we hear a lot about social innovation or about innovation in America, and especially we hear about that in business. It's great to think outside the box, like don't color inside the lines, like the fastest person wins, you know, all this kind of stuff. But we don't think that way about people who push the boundaries of norms in social or identity realms. And I think that these individuals, just like business leaders who we revere for innovating, can show us where our norms don't work and push us to consider another more comprehensive way of viewing and understanding the world. So if we could think about social innovators as just that, individuals who are pushing us to be more inclusive, to look at the ways in which our norms don't work, to be more accurate in the way that we approach ourselves and others, the way we study others, we might decrease the negative sentiment around those that don't follow the rules of society. So instead of looking at these folks as rabble-rousers or troublemakers, we can look to those who queer our norms with curiosity and an open mind. And I think if we all paid more attention to social innovators and learned from their approach, we might answer questions that no one has thought to ask before. We might open up whole new fields of knowledge. We might hear new voices that have been silenced for too long. And we might come to understand more completely and inclusively how work and life might fit together for all employees, and that benefits everyone. So that's what I have to say, and I would love to hear from you.
For any Q&A for the video, we're going to pass around a mic, okay? So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll come to you with the mic.
Go ahead.
Okay.
So I'm actually curious, what was your experience finding participants for these studies, and how did you find them, and were there challenges there just to collect the data?
I had pretty well cemented, I think that it's always a challenge finding participants who are facing stigma. One of the strategies that I've used that I think has worked really well, and it wasn't even necessarily a strategy initially, but I became very involved in LGBT activist communities prior to starting this project. And I think that once you're a trusted entity within some of these communities, people think, okay, well, I'm an ally to the LGBT community. I should have mentioned that at the start. I don't identify as LGBT or T, but I feel like because I had spent a lot of time really listening and learning within the communities, people were more willing to like share my call for participants with others and made snowballing a little bit easier. I also, Philly is I used to live in Philly, and it's a really gay-friendly city. And so I also went and would spend time in some like gay bars there and stuff, and put my flyers up and talk to people. And once they talked to me for a little while, I'm like, okay, maybe we could hang out and talk and whatnot. So I say I used maybe unconventional methods, but trust is really important, I think, and particularly in the studies that I'm doing now in transgender populations, some of the folks in this community have been burned really bad by researchers. Especially when I was in the psych department, like a transgender person sees psychology, research study, transgender, and they're like, yeah, no thanks. I'm not really sure what you're gonna do with this information. Are you gonna produce a report that says like all transgender people are crazy or something? You know what I mean? Because that's actually happened within the community before, and they share, these networks, this information gets shared. So I think cementing yourself in the community and being a known ally is the best thing that I did. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. So my question is more on the about being an ally, and I guess I'm coming from my experience as being outside the American society, and I can feel the invisibility, but that doesn't come from somebody's racism, but more so their political correctness sometimes, that they don't know if they can ask certain questions. So did people talk anything about they don't include you because they don't know whether it's the right question to ask, and therefore it becomes more difficult to have that conversation.
Yeah. I think that better and more positive dialogue could be happening in a lot of different places. I think there's some reasons that it's not. So one, I think that when you have a history of engaging in dialogue with people who maybe don't have great intentions or are not asking questions with the intent of learning, but are asking questions in a more mean-spirited or negative fashion, it makes people more closed off to want to share that information. And there's a whole literature on disclosure about how people signal, who can I talk to, who's gonna be open to this conversation, et cetera. So from the perspective of LGBT individuals, I think it's difficult to know how to feel out who's an okay person to actually, if you're asking the question, how do I give an answer? And then I think also there's a history of sort of being invisible, and that creates, in another paper in trans populations, we studied the development of what's called functional paranoia, which is basically like I'm self-protecting, but it actually has helped me in the past to be able to function socially. So there's also this like, why are you asking? What's your intent? You know, so it creates more defensiveness, I think, going into the conversation from the part of an LGBT person, which is understandable, but also when someone is asking from a well-intentioned perspective and maybe says the wrong thing or doesn't ask it quite right or whatever, it creates this like, whoa, that was just a question. I wasn't, you know, and then I'll never ask that question again, right? So I think that there's a lot of history and steepedness that people come into these conversations with that create that difficulties for having dialogue. So I have been trying to address it from the ally perspective of asking people to sort of step back and take perspective of the kinds of conversations that that individual maybe has participated in the past and think about how do I approach this, even if I don't use all the right words or the right language, how do I approach this by first building some camaraderie to let the person know what my intent is and being transparent about, I'm really trying to learn. And usually I find that if there's some of that backstory and connection ahead of time, the conversation goes a lot better. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for coming here.
Thanks
I
for
think
having
my
me.
favorite part of your study is the sample that you added at the end.
Yeah.
So that you could show that it really was an additional
Yeah.
layer, not just a different flavor of the same thing.
Yep.
I think that was really, really creative. So thank you very much for that. We'll applaud in a minute. I just want to tell you a couple other things. First, I forgot to acknowledge earlier that we have a lot of staff members in the room from Purdue, and I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm so happy that you're interested in these issues and that you feel welcome to be here, because that's really important to us as well. We're trying to make Purdue a better place too if we can, and if this helps you in your work, that's really valuable to us. Second, for those of you who are interested in these issues, or those of you, hint, hint, who might have to write prelims in your life, the list of the top 20 articles for every one of the last 20 years is at the website for the Center for Families and also Boston College that all of these leading scholars from around the world have found for you. So feel free to use it in your teaching or when you have to do prelims. You know, you were giving me flashbacks because when I was at Penn State doing my Ph.D. in Human Development and Family Studies, I did an MBA. And I had that same feeling that you did. This was many, many, many years ago, but this sense that I felt like a little bit of an imposter, a little bit of a spy almost in the MBA program. And there would be questions that I would ask that sometimes I felt like people in the room were looking at me like, why are you here? Like, where did this come from? So yes, I was bonding a little bit with you over
Still
that.
happens to me a lot, I think.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you who have come. I want to recognize again our partners in the Kanter School of Management, Department of Psychological Sciences, thank you, Department of Human Development and Family Studies, the Susan Bulkley Butler Center for Leadership Excellence, the Jane Brock Wilson Center. I'm so glad to be doing this collaboration with them. You have the list of articles in your hand from this year. You'll see that Katina's paper is one of the finalists, and you can get more information about the award and all of the articles in the web. And we will see you next year, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you.